Okay, so I'm going to get started. Thank you everyone for being here. My name is Cecilia Palmer. I am a mental health counselor with the Hamilton Family Health Team. I've been working with them for a number of years now, and I'm very excited to be presenting this topic of understanding loss during COVID-19. A lot of my training and background has been working with people who are adjusting to losses, whether it is loss related to death or non-death related losses, and supporting them through that process. And so it is 1:03 and we are going to dive right in. So thank you so much, and let's get started. So in today's session, we're going to develop a greater understanding of the various forms of non-death related loss experienced as a result of the pandemic. And we're going to learn some strategies for taking care of ourselves in these really difficult times. So what we want to think about is this pandemic has really changed how the world is operating right now and how we're responding. And as a result of the pandemic, we have this big primary loss. So if you can see sort of in the middle here, we have the pandemic, and that is our primary loss that we've experienced, the thing that has changed in our world as we know it. And because of that, we have also had all of these other substantial losses. So for some of us, we are experiencing the loss of employment. Our income has changed. What we thought was our financial security has been altered. We've absolutely lost things like our routine and predictability. From one moment to the next, we're not always sure what's happening. Even in our current region, we're seeing other parts of the province reopen while we're still in a phase 1. We are not sure what that will look like, when that will change for us, when it won't change. And even things like the reopening of certain businesses and services seems to surprise us sometimes, and we can't always predict what things are gonna look like. And all this can lead to feelings of loss and unknown and some anxiety and worry. We have a loss of control because a lot of these things we have no power over taking care of. We have no power over what's going to happen in our future. And for that, that loss of power, that sense that we had control of the world, is really, really difficult to deal with. Some of us are experiencing illness, death during this time, either our own illness or illness of loved ones. And when our loved ones or we have to go into hospital, even that experience is very different. We're not able to have our friends around, our family around in the same way. And care has altered a little bit because of the concern for COVID and trying to ensure that there are outbreaks in institutions like hospitals. We've experienced some loss of friendships and relationships. Some people, are not living in the same city. Some people are not living in the same country. And so we are not able to engage with the people we care about most who are at distance from us. Many of us, this is the time where wedding season is beginning for a lot of people. Celebrations are beginning for a lot of people. Graduations, birthdays, Father's Day is around the corner. And these are all rituals and celebrations that had closeness, connection, people gathering, celebrating together. And we're having to alter and shift the way we respond to those. And in some ways, we're not having any celebration at all. And it is absolutely understandable that these are making us feel the loss of what we were hoping for, especially those kids graduating high school who've worked, or university or college, who've worked really hard to get to where they are, and now they're not able to enjoy that. Really, we're having this cultural, societal, worldwide collective loss of normalcy, and fear of future disruptions have left us experiencing reactions that are actually more common with loss and grief than we would think about it originally. And what we know about grief reactions is that they're universal. So all of us have feelings of grief from time to time. And even though it's a universal experience, they are individual. How each one of us responds to our grief is really highly individual to each one of us. And grief will include things like emotional, physical, behavioral, cognitive or thinking, and spiritual reactions. And the truth is that some of the people participating may feel like, well, it hasn't really affected me too much, or this seems to be affecting me way more than other people. And so I just sort of want to bust a myth around this idea that we're all in the same boat here. So I want you to think that, COVID and this pandemic is like a storm that has been thrust on us that we weren't anticipating, and we are all in our own individual boats. And how that storm affects us really depends on the boat that we have. So some of us are riding around the storm in a yacht or a cruise ship. And so when the waves of the pandemic hit them, they can withstand the storm a little bit easier. Some of us are on rowboats, but some of us are even in shipwrecks. And so if that is your lived experience during a pandemic, the storm is going to be felt much differently, even though it's the same storm. We also have this overall collective loss of that assumptive world. So all those sort of secondary losses, loss of routine, predictability, illness, health, loss of entertainment and social life, all of those are part of our assumptive world. So collectively, what it is a loss of the world that we assume to be true. Prior to January, well, March sort of, but prior to the time when the pandemic was happening in Canada, we had some sense of what the world was. We had well-defined expectations about what life is, what birthdays are like, what holidays are like, what summer is like, and all of those have been lost at the moment, and we're not sure what they're going to look like. And so our assumptive world operates to keep us feeling safe, and like we can predict what's happening. It helps us plan for the future. And when we have these primary and sort of secondary losses happen, it really affects our ability to think about the future and our world as being something that we're familiar with. So it's sort of that idea of when we're engaging in the world right now, it looks like the same world that we've always known, but it feels awfully different. It doesn't feel inside of ourselves like it's the same world that we had 6 months ago. And that can really sit uneasy with a lot of us. So we're going to define a few different definitions of types of loss that exist. So we're going to talk about loss of or non-death loss. So we can grieve anything significant to our lives. So you can have a feeling of grief over dropping your favorite coffee mug that was passed down perhaps from a grandparent that you've had for a long time. And if something like that was to get destroyed, you would feel sadness and maybe some anger and frustration and loss associated with that. So the non-death losses happen all the time in our lives. They happen with sad events, and they even happen with good events. So I'll use when somebody moves out of their home for the first time and ventures on their own, there's a sense of joy and wonder and excitement about what's to come. But there's also this loss about what was will never be again. I'm never going to be that kid living back at home. When you buy your first house, or when you get married, or when you have all these sort of, if you're a parent and your child takes its first steps, there's very much that sense of joy and wonder and excitement about what's to come. But it's also knowing that, that one step means that you're losing a baby at this time. Like your baby is no longer going to be a baby. So loss is woven into our lives in all of these really little ways and all these really big ways as well, in minor experiences and major ones. So some of the things that non-death losses that we're experiencing now are loss of social contact, not being able to see your faces as I'm having this talk with you. So I'm trying to look in the camera and trying to help you guys feel like I'm there in your space, trying to have this conversation. But, I don't get to see your faces. And so there's some loss with that, because that's really a joyful thing when you present information, is to share that and see how others respond to your sharing. We're missing those connections, small and little. We're not talking to people in the grocery aisle in the same way anymore. We're not having those small little interactions with the world at large. And those small interactions are actually a very important part of our health and wellness. We're also missing those deeper connections. We are not able to as easily hug and touch and be in contact with the people that we love. And that lack of physical affection and connection with the people who we're closest with can be a really difficult thing to be missing. And in some cases, for those of us who have been separated from loved ones across borders, it can be even more difficult to not be able to see somebody, and also not to be able to predict when you might be able to see them again. Our loss of sense of safety. Right now is a particularly difficult time in our history as humans, for COVID reasons and non-COVID reasons, and that shakes our core again, that assumptive world of this place is very safe. Our assumptions of health have changed. If we've seen ourselves a primarily healthy person and we hear about young people getting ill with COVID and having very significant health complications as a result, our perception of ourselves as healthy can change and augment, and that can be a difficult reckoning to deal with. Our sense of safety net could be eroding, so our thoughts around, as all these programs and services are coming out, CERB might be ending at some point. Wage bump ups for some of our frontline workers are changing. So are we going to be able to access the same level of safety net that we always have? And the other piece is what happens moving forward. Some of us might be concerned that some of the investments and money that we're putting in to deal with the pandemic what does that mean for our future financially as a country and as a region? Even our ability to find places to relax, our common spaces that used to feel like our refuge from life and our safe place. So places like the beach or a park. For some of us, I can sort of attest as a mom, grocery shopping once a week used to be a delight and some time alone, and now we're losing those common spaces that used to feel like a good place to go to relax and enjoy ourselves. We don't have those in the same way. And again, our sense of control is gone. So we talked a little bit about secondary losses. After experiencing any loss, people are often surprised to realize that there is a ripple effect, and that we're not just feeling the effects of loss from that primary things. We're not just grieving COVID. We're grieving all the things that COVID has impacted in our lives. And that can become really stressful and overwhelming for a lot of people. So I'm going to talk about ambiguous loss because it does tie to COVID to some degree. Ambiguous loss happens when you're not exactly sure what you've lost or who you've lost. It's sort of like, have we lost? Summer would be a good example of this. We lost overnight camps. Now we can maybe have day camps, but we're not sure what that looks like. And we're going to have childcare, but now we don't have festivals. And are we going to have sports? Am I grieving the loss of sports? Am I not grieving the loss of sports? So we're not really sure what's happening. And we have a tendency as humans to only allow ourselves to feel things that we can prove should be felt. And that impacts our ability to just allow ourselves to process the things we do feel, regardless of whether we think it should show up or not. So ambiguous loss can really come up and sort of interrupt our ability to process our feelings around what's going on in our lives. Cumulative loss, this comes in sort of when you're thinking about all the different secondary losses building on one another. Particularly, I found with a lot of the clients that I'm working with who've also had the death of somebody they love in the past year. Put on top of that, then COVID, put on top of that, some of the things that are happening in our current events, put on top of that, not knowing what's happening in the summer, put on top of that, not being able to have their wedding or have a wedding. So all of these things are building on top of each other. So it's basically, and these are happening in succession without us having an opportunity to process and feel and cope with what we've just gone through. So it is the experience of suffering a new loss before you've had the chance to grieve the first loss, or that feeling of having those losses in quick succession, one after another. Nonfinite loss. The pandemic has really taught us that we cannot control what the world brings us. So many young people right now have spent years working towards a particular career, only to be faced with uncertainty about what happens now. Can I even do that job? Is that job even viable right now? There are some of us who've been employed at the same place for a really long time, and that is impacted potentially from the pandemic. We're going to see businesses that will be able to survive the pandemic, and some businesses that have been really familiar to us not be able to survive it. So we're all going to have to adapt and change to whatever losses we occur. For a lot of us, this is happening through no fault of our own. And despite preparing and doing everything right, picking the right career path or saving or whatever we've done, we can do all the right things in this situation, and some of us will still experience some significant losses. And then there's anticipatory grief. You know, we have this collective loss of normalcy. We also can feel like there's more to come. Like we know what we've lost in the past, but we feel like what's next. And so I was just looking at the news before this, and I found out, for those of you who don't know, you know, Santa Claus Parade is not going to happen in Stony Creek this year. So I think in the spring we saw this like band of summer events get canceled one by one. And now as we're weaving into the fall and into the winter, we're going to see the ripple effects of those things. So it's like, okay, what am I going to lose next? What's coming next? And it makes you sort of elevated and anxious about what's going to be happening. So, and the thing is that we can have that mourning process in anticipation of losing something. So now I could be thinking about, oh, we don't have that ritual of a parade in December or in the end of November. And I've been thinking about that and feel sadness now. That doesn't mean that when we come to that point and it's around the holiday season and I'm remembering, oh yeah, that got canceled, that I will not feel grief at that time too, because I felt it today. So I want you to consider the fact that anticipatory grief doesn't necessarily prepare you or prevent you from feeling grief when you actually get to the place of losing what that event or person or place might have been. You know, guys, I just want to take a second to say, if there are any questions, you can just keep asking them either in the chat. Some people are using the Q&A function of Zoom. Either is okay. I'll get notification of both. So if there's any questions at any times, please feel free to let me know, and I will do my best to answer them. We don't have to be, you know, I'm not going to wait till a formal Q&A point of this. So disenfranchised grief, that's the result of a loss that isn't really socially sanctioned. A really easy sort of example of this is perhaps you've experienced a separation or a divorce, and maybe you're happy not to be married to somebody anymore, but if they were to die, you might grieve them still, and you might not recognize that grief and honor it. And not only you might struggle with that. Well, that's my ex, I shouldn't even, you know, it's not, you know, I'm not married to them anymore, I shouldn't be feeling how I'm feeling. But there might be some assumptions that people might have around you that you shouldn't be grieving that in the first place, that, oh, like, you don't care about them anymore, you're not with them anymore. And that's not true. So disenfranchised grief always occurs when a relationship is not recognized, if the loss is not acknowledged. You know, if you have young ones at home and you are schooling them during this pandemic and you've lost a bit of that school year, people will say, well, isn't it great that the kids didn't have to be at school? And, you know, you can be mixed and complicated about this, and that's okay. During the COVID pandemic, a lot of our secondary and symbolic losses will not be recognized, and it will lead to some feelings of invisibility or hidden grief reactions. You know, a lot of people who struggle with anxiety maybe initially found the pandemic actually a bit of a relief. Ooh, I don't need to, like, you know, I'm what I want to do, the world actually wants me to do, which is sort of isolate and stay home and stay safe. But, you know, I've also learned as this pandemic is going on that a lot of people who I've worked with to try to improve their coping with anxiety are now getting this place where they're grieving the loss of the progress they made towards coping with their anxiety, and are needing to find novel ways to to stay on top of the things that they've worked so hard for that you know, people aren't recognizing. They'll just think perhaps that they're excited that they don't have to go out anymore, and really they're thinking, but I worked so hard to be able to. Also, with a lot of loss and a lot of heartache happening in the world, we might feel less entitled to our feelings. We might feel losses that we're feeling. We might be sitting here doing a whole bunch of that comparison. Well, you know, I don't have it as bad. At least we don't have it as bad here as they have it there. At least, you know, I have a roof over my head. At least, blah, blah, blah. So we do all these justifications to try to make our uncomfortable feelings go away. And I want you to know that there's not some finite amount of suffering, and there's not somebody walking around being the judge of how much suffering is appropriate. If you're feeling something, you are able and allowed and permitted to feel it. That's okay. So what grief might feel like for you? It might feel like you're on edge and you're not exactly sure why. You have that sense of like startle a little bit, checking over your shoulder, waiting for that other shoe to drop, being super hypervigilant in grocery stores. Are people following the arrows? Which I'm finding, if you're finding, I don't know, some people can comment about this, but I find that as the weeks are going on, people are less and less following arrows in grocery stores. So we scan for potential threats. We have some persistent anxiety and overwhelm. We might freeze up. We might procrastinate because what's the point? We might feel like, what's the point? And so what you need to consider is that if you're anticipating danger and doom, it actually makes sense that you're staying a little bit more regulated, feeling a little bit more emotionally in control, that would be more challenging now. It makes more sense. You may also have increased anger at this time. So you might be shorter with people that you love. Small obstacles might feel super intolerable. You know, if you go to hang up a sweater any other day and your hanger snaps, you get another hanger and you move on with life. But maybe today's the day where your hanger snaps, and that was the snap that sort of broke the camel's back, so to speak, and it really made you upset because all of this buildup of anger and frustration about everything else is coming to surface. If you find yourself getting more riled up more often, I want you to try to be gentle with yourself. This is completely normal of a reaction to have during a time of collective trauma. You know, to sort of preface that, the feelings of anger, the feelings of frustration, those are absolutely appropriate and normal to have. What we always want to look at is how do we want to respond to that anger, right? Because we know that snapping at the people we love isn't actually the most effective way to deal with it. So we want to be mindful about it and not judge ourselves, and then find some ways to discharge that anger in more healthy ways. So grief also might feel like resigning ourselves to the worst case scenario. So that's like saying, you know, what's the point? Like the whole year is canceled. We won't be able to do anything fun. Preparing for everything that matters to you to be gone. You know, some people are stockpiling food or supplies. Some people are stockpiling. We're saving as much money as possible because they're worried the worst case scenario is going to happen. We do this as a protective measure to stop ourselves from being shocked or surprised if it does happen. This is a way that we try to keep ourselves safe. But really, too much preparing doesn't actually keep us safe. It keeps us sort of stuck and frozen and in that elevated sense of anxiety and panic. So preparedness is important. So I would say, like, prepare. But if you do find yourself fixated on mostly apocalyptic and disastrous possibilities and only those, if you don't balance those out a little bit, you may actually be doing more harm than good. So, you know, in CBT, we talk about this idea of realistic thinking. So yes, the worst thing could happen, but that's not a guarantee. So, you know, if you see a dog on the street, you don't want to assume, and you think, oh, that dog's going to bite me. That sort of worst case scenario. Well, there's no guarantee the dog would bite you, but also it's probably not a good idea to go up to every dog and just sort of start petting them without having a bit of caution. So you go up and think, there's a dog. Dogs can be really friendly, but some dogs can bite. So I'm going to be cautious and aware going up and I'll respond accordingly. So that's sort of a more balanced perspective. The other thing you might want to think about is, do you find yourself withdrawing or avoiding others, not answering calls, texts from people, isolating even from people that you live with, declining offers to connect with other people because what's the point? We can't really do it in person in the same way. Also, we avoid because we don't want to be burdens to others. And this is one of the paramount things that I find, is that people feel like they are supposed to struggle all by themselves, and that they shouldn't put, shouldn't put their worries or burdens on other people. But those people are often the first people who would want somebody to call them if they were struggling. If I was to say to you, if your, closest loved one was having a hard time, would you want them to keep that from you, or would you hope that they would come to you? And even if you were going through a hard time, would you still want them to share what they're struggling with? And I would say unanimously, I've heard yes to that answer. So if you're feeling like nobody wants to hear my problems, or it's not as big of a deal, or I don't want to, that person's dealing with that issue, so I don't want to put my burden on them, the simple solution is to ask them, hey, I'm really struggling with something. I know you've got a lot on your plate, but do you have the energy and time to dedicate to this? And you're giving them an opportunity to assert a boundary with you. The other thing you can do is, you might be feeling so exhausted and overwhelmed and you can't take on, maybe your burden load at this moment is too big, and somebody brings it to you. And I even had that situation happen. I had a friend reach out to me having a hard day, and it was after a particularly hard day of my work, and she reached out for support. And I found myself doing, when you get that reach out, and I went like in my mind when I got that text from my friend, and I said, I care about you, I have your back. Are you good if I check on you tomorrow, because I don't have the space and energy to show up for you the way you deserve today. And that's a good message. That sends a message that I care enough about you to let you know, to want to show up for you fully. And if I can't, I'm going to let you know so that I can at a better time. So try to use those boundaries in communication to help navigate that. Okay, there's nothing wrong with setting boundaries and taking care of yourself. I was able to be a much better friend to her the next day. And finally, you might feel completely exhausted. This is absolutely appropriate. You may be doing chores less. In this time, depending on what's on your plate, depending on what your boat looks like, you might find that you're not cleaning the floors as quickly, or things aren't getting dusted in the same way, or laundry sits a little bit longer. That's okay. You may find sleep disruptions. Those are also common when we're grieving. What we're really talking about is sort of that trauma response. We're kind of in this fight, flight, or freeze mode. When our body is going through fight, flight, or freeze mode too long and too sustained, we get flooded with all these stress hormones. We get amped up, hypervigilant, emotional, more quick to frustration, in case we need to react quickly. Or that's our body's like security mechanism, keeping us safe from any perceived danger. But one of the side effects of that is that we end up feeling a lot more worn down. So being so activated can really tire us out. This is particularly hard to deal with when you're having that exhaustion, because this is a time where lots of people, not so much now, but at the beginning for sure, we were hearing lots of messages about, oh, what's your excuse now? If you've always wanted to drop those 5 pounds and now you're at home, what's your excuse now? Or, look how I've organized my closet in 15 easy steps. Or I was able to start my own online business at home because, I'm going to be productive during this time. So when we see images of other people seemingly having these wonderful active lives during the pandemic, and we're struggling to get out of bed, it can really impact our feelings about ourselves and feel like there's something wrong with us for not being able to do that. And I'm just going to put that out there. You can't always believe what you see in social media. So things to remember: you may have these signs: trouble focusing on normal tasks. It feels almost like your brain is in a fog, more or less sleep than usual, anger and irritability, physical sensations. So having more frequent headaches, more frequent stomach upset and stomach issues is common, the fatigue and low energy. This can also bring up feelings of past griefs that you've had. You might find that you're engaging in activities that used to be, I mean, I think we're calling about the pandemic 15 we're talking about now. We may be engaging in activities such as eating or drinking or online shopping to cope with anxiety. So sort of masking our feelings through other maybe less helpful coping strategies. And we may also avoid thinking or talking about the pandemic. So one of the things, two things I want you to know about this grief is first, it's normal and natural. Grief is a sign of love and attachment. And, you know, if you are grieving now, you may have really had aspects of your life that pre-pandemic that you really loved and you were attached to. And so grief is a normal reaction to a loss. We all experience it. All of us experience it in our lives. And second, what is important to know is grief actually responds best to awareness, attention, and expression. You will feel better if you mourn. And when I say mourn, I don't necessarily, I think the comic of mourning comes up, which is, you know, falling over something and sobbing profusely. That's not necessarily the only way to mourn. But mourning by being aware of your grief, giving it the attention it deserves and needs, and expressing it outside of ourselves in some ways. The good news is humans tend to be really resilient in the face of grief. There's something called complicated grief disorder that only affects like 7% of the population. So typically people get through, you know, 93% of the population gets through grief in pretty common, healthy ways, even though it can feel really overwhelming and difficult. So how do we cope with COVID and the feelings of grief and loss that we're experiencing? Whatever you're feeling, no matter what type of loss you've experienced, it's important to remember that what you feel is valid and that you're not alone, that we are collectively experiencing grief. It's a universal emotion and experience. So these are some things that you can do to help. So you want to practice self-care, and I use this idea of treating yourself like a pet or a plant, whatever one kind of fits your fancy the best. So in terms of treating yourself as a pet or plant, you have to, what are the things that you have to do to keep those things alive? Well, you need to feed them. You need to give them a little bit of nourishment. You need to make sure they get a little bit of sunlight every day. You need to, you know, sometimes you take them for a walk or you put them out in some fresh air. You need to make sure they get enough water and hydration, and you need to talk nicely to them. So pets and plants actually both do not respond well to yelling, screaming, and criticism. They respond better to positive, loving, warm thoughts and actions. So if you can try to think about how you're engaging with yourself if you're struggling, and think, what would I do for my pet right now? What would I do for my plant right now? And try to use that towards yourself. You also want to think about self-care, and self-care is a little bit misunderstood. I'm just going to take a sip, give you guys a chance to ask any questions you might have. Self-care was just telling me I needed some hydration. So self-care is very much misconstrued as getting your nails done or avoiding tasks or activities or indulging in a special treat. And really, those are kind things and those are nice things to do for yourself once in a while, but those aren't necessarily conducive to like a whole well-rounded self-care. So when we talk about self-care, we think about feeling our feelings without judging them. And like I've said a little bit earlier in today's presentation, giving yourself permission to feel what you feel is important. This is big work that I do every day with clients, is this idea of, you know, they only seem to want to give permission to the feelings that they feel ought to show up, and anything else they want to judge and avoid. And so if you can walk away from this with anything, it's that all feelings are okay, all feelings get to show up, and you sort of want to feel them but not feed them. You let them be there, you acknowledge them, and then you give them permission. You ask that emotion what it needs in order to feel a little bit better or to move on or do its thing. So feeling your feelings without judgment. If you need to ask why something's showing up, why am I feeling this way? try to ask that why a little bit more compassionately. Why am I feeling this way? You know, I thought this would make me happier if I was doing this. Why isn't this making me as happy as I thought? That's very different than, why am I feeling upset about this? I should be happy. So the tone in which you talk to yourself, like the plant or the pet, really matters in this case. Make some space for playfulness. It's important to play and have fun. Somebody said, I don't know who said, play is the language of children. I don't think we grow out of that. I think we need to have some fun and some joy and some laughter and lightness into our day in order to be balanced and well cared for. We want to practice those kind things as well as the compassionate things. So we want to, sure, take a bath. If you wake up and you ended up tossing and turning all night and you had a to-do list a mile long, go through that to-do list and shorten it. That's a kind thing to do to yourself, and that's honoring and listening to yourself. And those are okay to do sometimes. Sure, have a bubble bath from time to time. I think self-care is also about actively discouraging unsolicited advice. So when we're struggling, sometimes we turn to people we care about for support, and what we want them to do is to listen without judgment, and we just want somebody to bear witness to our struggle. And we can get a lot of answers thrown at us about how we should do or why we should have known better than to find ourselves in this position in the first place. So I think we have the right to set up a boundary and say, actually, you can even front load somebody, or, you know, before you talk to them or unload, say, okay, I'm having a hard time. I don't need you to do anything more than, I just need this to land somewhere. Can you do that for me? And give them permission to say, yes, I can, or no, I can't. And then the other piece is respecting your time and others expecting others to respect your time as well. You're allowed to put yourself to make yourself as important as you make everybody else in your life. And a lot of us struggle with making sure we take care of everyone else before we take care of ourselves. And I like this idea of taking care of ourselves as well as we take care of other people, especially if we like taking care of others, because it helps us to be able to do that longer, more sustained. The other thing I want you to think about are these concepts of giving yourself time. So, you know, when it comes to grief and feelings of loss, there's really no finish line. There's no set point where we know somebody is done. It is reasonable to expect that one day I might be looking into my grandchild, sitting with my grandchild, helping them do their history homework, and come across information about the pandemic. And, you know, all the feelings that we're feeling now, the sadness, the losses, all of that is going to come up for me at that time, even though, you know, I'm old and gray and lots of life has happened since the pandemic. It's not unusual that at some point it may come up again. There's also no reward for speed. There's no invisible, like, first place prize for getting through this faster than other people. Who's keeping track of that anyway? A lot of people judge how they're doing based by how long it's taking them to get through something. And in this sort of need for speed society that we have, which we're kind of all having to take a break from, frankly, we are finding ourselves looking around and comparing and seeing if we're doing it as quickly or quicker than other people. So no reward for speed in this, okay? And the other concept is this idea of divine momentum, and that is trusting that you are in your grief and in your loss exactly where you need to be. If you are feeling, and in this pandemic, so if you're somebody who is going through this pandemic and feeling like, not so bad, yeah, there's some things that suck, but I'm doing okay. That's your boat. That gets to be your feeling. That gets to be your experience. If you're going through this pandemic and it feels hard to get out of bed, that's okay. That's your boat. That's your experience. You know, if you find that, you can get some support around that. So that way, if you are in that boat and that you are in that struggle, you can invite somebody to jump on board with you and support you through that. So we want to look at validating feelings. I see we got a question here. Oh, this is a great question. I like this question. Thank you, participant. Could you please repeat what you would say to someone who always feels the need to fix things, but you just need to listen, need them to listen? So what I would say is I would call them up and I would say, hey, you know, Jerry, I know you care about me and you always want to give me the best advice in the world. Can I tell you what I need from you right now? I'm just having one of those days where I just need to, like, have it go somewhere. I can't hold on to it right now. do you mind just like listening to me, kind of, you know, like offload or give you kind of the things that I'm struggling with? I don't need you to say anything. In fact, I already kind of know what I want to do about this. I just need a place for it to land. Do you think you could do that for me? And then if they say, oh yeah, I can do that for you, but really they can't do that for you, then you get to the end of offloading or letting them know what's going on, and they say, oh, well, here's what you should do. I know what your problem is. Say, you know, you care so much about me, you want to give me some answers to fix it. I'll take it under advisement, but I feel like I got a good handle on this. Thank you for listening. I appreciate that you've been able to listen to me talk about what I'm struggling with here. And you've done exactly what I needed by just being a supportive ear. So you kind of like almost reinforce what you're asking of them by telling them that they're doing it for you. And it's a way of doing that. Also, I think something to consider is that, you know, before you call somebody, if that's what you really need, before you call somebody, think back to your previous conversations and ask yourself if they have the capacity to do that. Normally, those fixers in our lives are just trying to deal with their own anxiety. You know, particularly when somebody is suffering and in struggle, we have not learned to be comfortable with that, and so we feel like it's our duty or an obligation to make somebody happy. And so sometimes we need to relieve people of the pressure of that. And sometimes we feel we can't make somebody happy, then we're not doing our jobs. That's about their anxiety and their struggle. That's not about you. And that's often not about them it's not about them not trusting you to know what to do. Sometimes it's their own anxiety feeling the need to fix. Okay, so I hope that helps answer that question. So validation, this is an important technique. As we were talking about giving permission for our emotions to be there, whatever our emotions are, the best way to do that is to validate. And even with, you know, your friend who says that they'll listen and decides not to, you can validate for them how hard it must be to listen to this. You know, here I just dropped this big bomb on you, and you're probably struggling to figure out what to do with this, and it probably feels uncomfortable to hear all this stuff. But I appreciate your willingness to listen to it and just be there for me as a supportive presence. So you can sometimes do that. Sometimes I'll even say to loved ones who want to give good advice to me, it's really hard for you to see me suffer and struggle through something. And, you know, I can see you really wanting to try to find a solution because you care so much about me. It just hurts to kind of see me struggle like this. Depends on the person who you can do that with. So know your people well. So in terms of validating feelings, there's no right or wrong way to feel. That has been like on repeat for me for this presentation. Our feelings will depend on the boat that we're in. And the other piece that is super important when you're thinking about validation is not the same as agreeing with somebody. So when you are validating somebody, you're not saying you are completely right, even if you don't agree with them. What you're saying is, I can see how you see it. I can see that, you know, so validating pineapple on pizza, if I hate pineapple on pizza, validating wouldn't be, you're right, actually pineapple is the best pizza topping. Validation would sound like, yeah, I could see why some people might really like a sweet thing or fruit on a pizza. It certainly seems to be like, and you like sweet things, so it makes sense that you would probably like sweet things on a pizza too. You're not changing your mind about you thinking pineapple's gross on pizza. It's just acknowledging that you can see that they do like it. So that's how I want you to think about that validation. So here's some examples of what to say and what not to say. So invalidation would sound like, well, at least it's not, so I'm thinking of an example. So if your hours have been reduced at work as a result of COVID, and you tell somebody, and they say, well, at least you haven't lost your job, at least you still have a job, right? That's not necessarily validation. That's not the thing that's going to be most helpful. You can say for them, they were counting on those hours. You put yourself in their perspective, they were counting on those hours. That's hard. That's a real struggle. Like, you had budgeted your whole life around those particular hours, and now you find yourself like in this race to figure out how you're going to pull things together when that was certain for you just a couple months ago. Look on the bright side. Again, there's that need to fix and make somebody happy. And that is inborn in our nature. We are very uncomfortable with feelings that are not pleasant. So it's okay to say this is painful. If you sprain your ankle, you don't feel better when somebody says, well, at least it's not broken. You feel better when somebody says, oh, like that must have really hurt, right? Like that tells our bodies and our souls and our minds, somebody gets what you're feeling, somebody knows what it's like, and somebody cares about you. You're overreacting. If you ever want to make somebody actually react stronger and bigger, tell them that they're overreacting to something. What you want to do is say, well, it makes sense that you would be that upset about them being, that store being out of your particular brand of apples, because that was your grandma's favorite recipe with those apples. And, all you want is to feel a little bit closer to her right now in a time of uncertainty. That makes sense to me, right? So validation's not agreeing. You don't need to like jump the fence and go into somebody else's perspective and find them. If you're more conservative, you don't need to like go to somebody who's a lot more liberal and say, well, yeah, I absolutely agree with your lifestyle. Now you've changed me. But you can say, from your lived experience, I see why that makes sense for you, right? We can acknowledge where people are at, and that's okay. What to do with those big emotions? So because we've done such a bang up job right now in society of trying to convince everybody that their goal is to be happy all the time, and if you fail to be happy all the time, then it's some personal failing on your part. We do a lot of our work trying to unpack that stuff, to undo that stuff, to let you know that if you're feeling sad and anger and frustration and fear, congratulations, you're a human being. And yes, those can go to the point where they interrupt our ability to have a meaningful life. And yes, we should get support around that. But all of those emotions are part of a normal lived human experience. So fighting an emotion does not help. It actually takes more energy to fight or try to validate your emotion, or like before you show up for it. And when you suppress that emotion, it only shows up later and a little bit stronger. So if we let our feelings like flow, they kind of pass through us. So if I'm feeling angry about something, I acknowledge, okay, so I'm really angry. I was expecting that person to call me at 5 o'clock. And, last time I remember I wasn't feeling well and I called them right at 5 o'clock because I promised that. And I'm somebody whose word matters to me. And so, yeah, I'm feeling anger about that. Okay, so I'm angry. And then you can let that go a little bit more. So you want to feel that, but you also don't want to feed that emotion with more thoughts. You don't want to create a story about, well, they're not calling me at 5 because I've never mattered to them and they're always thinking about their other friend. I bet you they're on with Susan because they never call me. I knew they never liked me that much anyway. I'm just probably looking for an excuse to avoid me. So when you do that, you create a story, you get caught up in ruminating about that. It actually makes you more grounded and more disappointed and more frustrated, and it makes that emotion get bigger and bigger and bigger. So if you find yourself doing that, take a pause, take a step back, take care of yourself, take a break, move your attention to something a little bit more pleasant or neutral. Even just thinking about, okay, I'm just going to take a breath now and let that breath out. And just focus on that breath for a second. Go to somewhere a little bit more neutral. A little bit of distraction is okay if your emotions are getting too overwhelming, if they feel like they're getting too big. So feel it, don't feed it. You can use the approach from Kristen Neff called self-compassion, and you can Google her. She's really easy to find online. If you Google self-compassion or Kristen Neff, you will be able to find her information. She's got a great website. So you want to use her strategies, which is how you would treat a friend, really. You would first acknowledge the hurt or the suffering, or today's been a hard day for me, like having to work from home and having to try to get my kid to schoolwork and trying to get a presentation done. That was a hard day for me. So you acknowledge that. The second step would be to recognize that you're not alone in that that's a human lived experience. So that would sound like validation. It makes sense that today was a harder day. Anybody who had to juggle all those things on the same day might find that they were a little bit more stressed out by the end of the day. That makes sense. That's okay that you're feeling that. And then you would offer the same comfort or kindness that you would a friend. So that would be like something like, so what does the rest of the day need from me? You know, if I was going to go and vigorously mop and clean my floors, maybe before I go do that, if that's still something I have to do today, maybe I go for like a 20-minute walk just to collect my thoughts and to soothe myself and to kind of breathe a bit better energy into me. So that's something where you can do, you know, 3 sort of steps to kind of bring yourself to a place where you can cope with your emotions. So we're not trying to get you to get rid of your emotions. Emotions are important and needed. We just want you to show up for them in a way that's meaningful, and that's really helpful when you're having emotions related to grief. Be sure to extend that same compassion to others. We're all in this together. So some other things that you can do: reach out to family and friends. We have our limits on distancing. Reframe social distancing as physical distancing. This whole idea of social distancing makes it sound like we can't be in connection with others, and we can. We just have to do it much differently now. There's lots of supports. So the Hamilton Family Health Team, if you're a patient of a doctor, connected with the Hamilton Family Health Team. And if you find that, you know, the things we talked about, that your needs are greater than the things that we've talked about here, reach out. We're here to support you. If you're not a patient, then there are resources available. The Canadian government has launched Wellness Together Canada. It has supports for mental health and for substance use. And there's the link and website there. So also you just can Google Wellness Together Canada and you can find that information. In Hamilton and the surrounding areas, if you ever are experiencing a mental health crisis, or if you're having some suicidal thoughts or ideations, or somebody you're concerned about is, then you can call COAST, the number's there, or the Barrett Center. Both of those are 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, providing telephone-based supports. And if you or somebody you care about is in immediate danger, you can call 911, okay? So this is really a time of uncertainty and change, but there are things that we can do to keep ourselves and others safe. We can keep our physical distance, we can wash our hands, we can call friends, play games online across distances, we can work at home, we can help others, and we can also avoid getting lost in those worst case scenarios and actually create more realistic contingency plans for ourselves. So I want you to really think about the things that you can't control and let go of those things. We can't control how long this is going to go on. We can't control how other people are going to be reacting. We can't control or predict what the future is going to hold. What we can control, though, is our attitude, how we take care of ourselves, turning off the news when it gets too much, taking a break from that, and finding ways to find our kindness and our grace for ourselves. So those are all things that we can take care of together and for others. So I want you to think about, as we wrap up, acceptance. And acceptance in the mindful context means that even when the unthinkable happens, we honor ourselves and our experiences with dignity and kindness. So rather than turning our backs on our own suffering, our own lived experience, we treat ourselves as we would a beloved friend. So I want to thank everyone for coming. There is a poll, and I just want to call my colleague on here. I think I know how to do this. I'm going to launch the polling. And if I can ask people to fill this out and give us some feedback so that the next time I go to roll with this presentation, I can make it even better. You know, if there are other topics you're interested in or you can let us know, and we are happy to try to meet the needs of the community. So thank you so much for attending. We do have a few minutes left for those of you who have any questions. And again, I feel super grateful to be able to be here with you today to share this information. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let it go to 3 minutes where I'm just going to stay quiet, hydrate myself, and wait for questions. And then at 2 o'clock, if there's no questions or comments, then I'll just shut this down, and maybe we'll see each other virtually up there again someday soon. So I do have a question. Do we know how we can play board games with family online or online? One of the ways that I found is Pictionary. So I've actually done where, I'll do one really quickly, and I'm hopefully a much better speaker than I am a drawer, but I kind of did, something like this. And, we have some seconds where I would, make something and then I'd put it up for people to guess. And then somebody would hopefully be able to see board game or a bicycle, somebody riding a bicycle. And that's how I played online. There are some that you can play through apps. I know you can do shared viewing on Netflix. Some people are watching shows on Netflix. And you can, there are lots of, if you go on Facebook, on community plays, there are also lots of trivia nights that are happening that you can join on to. And somebody also shared that there's something called House Party app, and that's an app that you can download and enjoy with your friends and family for a game. So it's called House Party app. And I think that's it, guys. We're at 2 o'clock. I want to say I appreciate everybody for coming out and being here with me today. It's been really joyful, and I hope that everybody is able to stay safe and stay well.